Hello and welcome to a lecture on Key Concept 2.11, which is a comparison of the Spanish, the French, the Dutch, and British colonizing efforts in the New World. So we have the three main ones, the Spanish, the English, and the French, that would settle and ultimately compete for North America. The Dutch and the Swedes also settled, but would be swallowed up by the English. This is New York and Delaware. And of course, it's not empty wilderness, as millions of natives live and occupy the land and had sovereignty and control over it. Now we'll start actually over in Europe. This is a map of Europe in 1600, and a couple of things that we should sort of note on here when we look at this map. First, these are mostly all kingdoms. The Netherlands is an exception. Second, the Ottoman Empire is much larger and more powerful and controlled access to the lucrative Asian markets, which are shut off to Western Europe. Western Europe was relatively weak compared to the great empires of the time, the Ottomans, the Mughal in India, the Ming over in China. They're backwater places, but they're soon to rise in great power, especially the English. And finally, there's the religious divide. Spain and France are strongly, loyally Catholic, whereas England is going through a battle between the Church of England, the Anglicans, and the Puritans, and the Dutch in Northern Europe are decidedly Protestant. So who came for each of these? For the English, it's a diversity coming over, and a big key difference with the Spanish and the French is that both men and women coming over, which is going to lead to more viable populations. For the Spanish, mostly men, soldiers and priests coming over, and for the French, again, also mostly men, and they're coming over for the fur trade. Catholics only, Protestants forbidden. So there's a big key difference is the English had a little bit more diversity and men. The English also welcomed other Europeans coming over, Scottish, German, Scotch-Irish, and also about 1 out of 5 people in their colonies will be African slaves as well. Now, this diversity is one key factor in the development of a new American identity. There's a strong English component to this identity, but ultimately the Americans will define themselves as being both English and not English, something else, something unique. So population growth, well, the English, because they had women and they welcomed other Europeans, they had rapid population growth. The Spanish, a large part of their population was a mix between natives and Europeans. And for the French, very, very slow for them. Few women, and most of the men are off doing the fur trade. So New France down here at the bottom, you can see very low. Here's that rapid, exponential growth of the British colonies. And Spain, large population, but again, it's a mixed one. Whereas the British one, it's mostly all European. 1 out of 5, of course, African. And this is comparing the English colonies in blue to England herself in red. And again, these are in the thousands. Both of these are in the thousands. So government, how did the government, also very different between the English and the Spanish and the French. For the English, the appointed governor, the crown, the king or queen appoints somebody to run each colony, but that person has to work with the locally elected assembly. So the governor would often be a nobleman coming over, but they don't have control over the money, which the locals do, so there's much greater autonomy. They're really being left alone. Whereas for the Spanish, the crown, the king, queen appoints a governor, but that person has absolute power and the people are expected to obey. Very similar with the French, where there's no political rights, no assemblies being allowed. Obey the king. Economic base, again, also a difference between the English and then the other two. For the English, diverse. Farming's the big one, but there's lots of other things going on, lots of trade, and there's restrictions on that trade. You can only do it within the British Empire, but it's still a very lucrative trade. And for the Spanish, extraction, gold, silver, lots of silver, and sugar plantations run by African slaves. And for the French, it's the fur trade, and everything else not so much going on there. So the English, much more viable, much more stable in theirs here. Religion, we've already touched on this a little bit. For the English, depends on which colony. In the northern colonies, strictly Protestant, very anti-Catholic. In the southern colonies, the Church of England is the established church. And in the middle, there's much more toleration and no established religion. For the other two, both Catholics and no Protestants allowed in theirs. Very strict in this. And they, of course, want to convert the natives to their Catholicism as well. So the relationship with the natives, the English and French are almost mirror opposites of each other here. for the English, a very negative attitude towards natives. It's to drive them off, kill them off, and there's a very much, an us versus them mentality and could not live together. They are considered savages. For the Spanish, a variation, enslavement, marriage, left alone, killed off, depends where. And for the French, they have a very positive relationship with them, mutual benefit, trade, sometimes a lot of intermarriage with French males and native females, and a lot more sort of respect and wanting to learn from the other. So we look just at the Spanish one. This is from the concept outline. Spanish efforts to extract wealth from the land led them to develop institutions based on subjugating native populations or converting them to Christianity and incorporating them, along with enslaved Africans, into Spanish colonial society. And they had a very rigid class structure based on blood. You're born in Spain, both your parents, you're a peninsular. Under that, you're European blood, but you've got one or both parents who were born in the New World, and then under those mixings and Native Americans and slaves at the very bottom of the power structure. And New Spain, which is the yellow down here, so they're in what's today Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean areas down there. And as just reminders, direct control by the Spanish crown, that strict hierarchy, natives for conversion or labor or slaughter, and they're trying to get people to move up north into Texas and California, and that's these areas here, but they don't really have a lot of control over those areas. They have influence but not control in those areas. For the French and the Dutch are very similar to the French in everything except religion. Colonial efforts involved relatively few Europeans and relied on trade alliances and intermarriage with American natives to build economic and diplomatic relations and acquire furs and other products for export. And so for New France, which is Quebec and Montreal on the St. Lawrence River, and down into the Great Lakes where they would travel, and then down into the Mississippi Valley to trade as well. And they had an outlet at New Orleans that they established down there. So few colonists, fewer women, fur trade is the big thing. They cannot impose themselves on the natives, and they're much more tolerant and cooperative with them. And then finally, just a summary statement here. The English colonies stood distinctly apart from the French, Dutch, and Spanish colonies. The French and Spanish colonies were Catholic only, predominantly male, run directly from the crown, and lacked a diverse economy. On the other hand, the English colonies attracted a variety of people that established viable permanent communities and a diverse economy. The strong sense of community also helped to create an us and them identity with natives. Therefore, English relations with natives was very unfriendly compared to the French and to a lesser extent the Spanish. All right, that concludes it. Thank you very much for listening.